The dust had barely settled from her boots hitting the ground when Margaret Dawson realized she had nothing left but the fury burning in her chest and the small leather satchel clutched in her trembling hands. She had worked the Double R Ranch outside Naco, Arizona for 3 years, ever since she turned 18 and needed to escape the suffocating memories of her parents' deaths from typhoid fever. The foreman, a cruel man named Silas Garrett, had been pocketing wages meant for the Mexican workers who broke their backs under the relentless sun. Margaret had seen the ledgers when she was cleaning the ranch office, seen the discrepancies, seen the theft. She had thought honesty mattered, thought speaking truth would make things right. Instead, old man Rutherford had called her a liar, accused her of trying to cause trouble, and told her to pack her things and get off his land before sunset. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Arizona territory as Margaret stood at the edge of the property, her calico dress dusty and worn, her dark blonde hair escaping from its braid. She was 21 years old and suddenly homeless, jobless, and watching her entire world crumble. The year was 1883, and women did not have many options in a place like Naco. She could try to find work in town, perhaps as a laundress or serving girl at the saloon, but those positions were scarce and often came with expectations she refused to meet. She turned toward the road that led into town, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. She would not give them the satisfaction. She had done the right thing, and if that meant losing everything, then so be it. But God, it hurt. It hurt so much she could barely breathe. "Hold on there, miss." The voice came from behind her, deep and measured. Margaret spun around, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she kept in her pocket. A man sat astride a stunning Palomino horse, his silhouette outlined against the harsh Arizona sky. He was tall even sitting down, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but she could see dark eyes watching her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "I do not have time for trouble," Margaret said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Please let me pass." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, landing lightly despite his size. As he stepped closer, she could see him more clearly. He was perhaps 25 or 26, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. There was something about his face that suggested both hardness and kindness, as if life had tried to beat the gentleness out of him but had not quite succeeded. "Name is Harrison Donnelly," he said, removing his hat. "I own a spread about 5 miles north of here. I was just concluding some business with Rutherford when I heard the commotion, heard him throwing you off his ranch." Margaret felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "Then you know I am apparently a troublemaker and a liar. Good day, Mr. Donnelly." She tried to walk past him, but he stepped into her path, not threateningly, but enough to make her stop. "I also heard what you said about the foreman stealing wages, and I heard Rutherford refuse to even look at the evidence." "What does it matter?" Margaret's voice cracked despite her best efforts. "I have no job, no references, and nowhere to go. The truth did not set me free, Mr. Donnelly. It cost me everything." Harrison studied her for a long moment, those dark eyes seeming to see right through her defenses. "I need someone to manage my household. My last housekeeper married and moved to Tucson. The job includes cooking, cleaning, and keeping the books for the ranch. I am not good with numbers, and my foreman is worse." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "You want to hire me after what just happened?" "I want to hire you because of what just happened," Harrison corrected. "Anyone who risks everything to speak up for people being cheated is exactly the kind of person I want working for me. The pay is $30 a month, plus room and board. You would have your own cabin on the property, separate from the main house. Respectable. Proper." $30 a month was more than she had been making at the Double R. It was more than most women could hope to earn anywhere. Margaret searched his face for signs of deception, for the catch that must surely be coming, but she saw only honest directness. "Why?" she whispered. "You do not know me." "I know you stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent," Harrison said simply. "I know you are standing here with nothing, about to walk into town with no prospects, and you are still holding your head high. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some tight knot of fear and despair beginning to unravel. I will not tolerate any impropriety, Mr. Donnelly. I may be desperate, but I'm not that desperate. A slight smile touched his lips, transforming his stern face. I would expect nothing less, Miss Dawson, Margaret Dawson. Well, Miss Dawson, you have my word as a gentleman that you will be treated with complete respect. I need an employee, not anything else. Do we have an agreement? Margaret looked back toward the Double R Ranch, where 3 years of her life had just been erased in a moment of cruel injustice. Then she looked at Harrison Donnelly, this stranger who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she had not even known how to form. Yes, she said firmly. We have an agreement. Harrison's smile widened slightly, and he gestured toward his horse. Can you ride? Not well, Margaret admitted. I mostly worked in the house at the Double R. Then we will take it slow. Come on, I will help you up. He laced his fingers together to form a step, and Margaret placed her worn boot in his hands. He lifted her easily onto the horse's back, then swung up behind her. She stiffened at the proximity, acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, but he kept a respectful distance as much as possible while still maintaining control of the horse. Hold on, he said quietly, and she gripped the saddle horn as they started moving. The ride to Harrison's ranch took nearly an hour, following dusty trails that wound through scrubland dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. The Santa Cruz Valley stretched around them, harsh and beautiful, with mountains rising in the distance like ancient sentinels. Harrison kept the horse at an easy walk, and gradually Margaret relaxed against the rhythm of the movement. How long have you had your ranch? She asked, partly to fill the silence and partly because she genuinely wanted to know about this man who had just changed the course of her life. Going on 4 years now, Harrison replied. I came out from Texas after my father died. He left me some money, enough to buy land and stock it with cattle. It has been hard work building it up, but it's mine. No one can take it from me. There was something in his voice, some old pain, that made Margaret glance back at him. Your mother? Died when I was 12. Fever took her. His voice was matter of fact, but she heard the echo of old grief. It was just me and my father after that. He was a hard man, but fair. Taught me that a man's word is his bond, and that you judge people by their actions, not their circumstances. He sounds like a good man. He was. Harrison paused, then added, What about your family? Both parents died 2 years before I came to work at the Double R. Typhoid fever swept through our town. I had nowhere else to go. Margaret swallowed hard. They were good people too, honest. They taught me to speak the truth even when it is difficult. Then you honored their memory today, even if it did not feel like it. The simple words struck something deep inside Margaret, and she had to blink rapidly to keep tears from forming. No one had framed it that way, had made her sacrifice into something noble rather than foolish. She found herself grateful that Harrison could not see her face clearly from his position behind her. When they finally arrived at Harrison's ranch, Margaret felt her breath catch. It was not as large as the Double R, but it was well maintained and purposeful. A sturdy main house built of adobe and wood sat at the center, with a barn, several outbuildings, and what looked like a small separate cabin off to one side. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and she could see several men working near the barn. Harrison dismounted and helped her down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The moment her feet touched the ground, he released her and stepped back. That is where you would stay, he said, pointing to the small cabin. It used to be the foreman's quarters before I built him a larger place closer to the bunkhouse. It has a bed, a stove, a table, and chairs, basic but comfortable. The main house is where you would do most of your work. Margaret walked toward the cabin, aware of Harrison following at a respectful distance. When she opened the door, she found exactly what he had described, but it was clean and well kept, with curtains at the windows and a colorful blanket on the bed. It was small, perhaps only 2 rooms, but it was hers, her own space, privacy and safety. It is perfect, she said softly, turning to face him. Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. Harrison, he corrected. We will be working together closely. Might as well use given names if that is acceptable to you. Then you must call me Margaret. He nodded, and she saw approval in his eyes. I will let you get settled. Come up to the main house when you are ready, and I will show you around, introduce you to the men. We keep simple hours here. Breakfast at dawn, lunch at noon, dinner at sunset. Sundays are for rest, though the animals still need tending. That sounds reasonable. Harrison hesitated at the door, his hat in his hands. Margaret, I want you to know that what I said earlier was true. You will be treated with complete respect here. Any man who steps out of line answers to me. You are safe here. The intensity in his voice, the absolute conviction, made Margaret's throat tighten. I believe you. After he left, Margaret sank down onto the bed and finally let herself cry. But these were not tears of despair anymore. They were tears of relief, of unexpected grace, of a future that had seemed impossible just hours ago. She had spoken up and it had cost her everything. But somehow, in the midst of loss, she had found something new, something that felt like hope. She allowed herself only a few minutes of emotional release before she washed her face in the basin, smoothed her hair as best she could, and walked up to the main house. If Harrison Donnelly had taken a chance on her, she would prove him right. She would work harder than anyone he had ever employed. She would show him that his faith in her was not misplaced. The main house was larger inside than it appeared from the outside, with a spacious main room that served as both sitting area and dining space, a generous kitchen, and what looked like 2 bedrooms in the back. It was clean but clearly lacked a woman's touch. There were no curtains on most of the windows, no decorations, nothing soft or welcoming about the space. Harrison was waiting in the kitchen, and with him was another man, older and weathered, with gray streaking his brown hair and kind eyes set in a lined face. Margaret, this is Tom Webster, my foreman, Harrison said. Tom, this is Margaret Dawson. She will be managing the household and keeping the books. Tom tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect that warmed her. Pleased to meet you, Miss Dawson. Lord knows this place needs a woman's hand. These men are savages when left to their own devices. Margaret found herself smiling. I will do my best to civilize them, Mr. Webster. Just Tom, miss. We are not formal folks here. Harrison walked her through the house, showing her where everything was kept, explaining the routines of the ranch. He had 7 men working for him, including Tom. They raised cattle primarily, with some horses. The ranch was still growing, still establishing itself, but it was profitable and stable. The books are in here, Harrison said, opening a drawer in a desk in the main room. I'm afraid they are a mess. I try to keep track, but numbers have never been my strength. I would be grateful if you could make sense of them. Margaret pulled out the ledgers and flipped through them. They were not as bad as he suggested, just disorganized. She could see he had been trying to track expenses and income, but the system was haphazard at best. I can fix this, she said confidently. It will take some time, but I can create a proper accounting system. I will leave you to it then. I need to check on the men. Harrison paused, looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. I'm glad you're here, Margaret. So am I, she replied honestly. Over the next few weeks, Margaret threw herself into her work with a determination that sometimes surprised even her. She rose before dawn to prepare breakfast for Harrison and any of the ranch hands who wanted to eat at the main house. She cleaned and organized, bringing order to the chaos Harrison had been living in. She made curtains from fabric she found in town, added small touches that made the house feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep. But it was the books that truly captured her attention. As she went through the ledgers, she discovered that Harrison was doing better than he realized. His expenses were well managed, his investments in livestock were paying off, and his land was productive. She created a new system of tracking, color-coding different types of expenses and income, projecting future growth based on current trends. Harrison would sit with her in the evenings, and she would explain what she had found. At first, he seemed almost intimidated by her knowledge, but gradually he began to ask questions, to engage with the information. She discovered he was not bad with numbers at all. He simply had never been taught to organize them properly. You could expand, Margaret said one evening, pointing to her calculations. If you used your profits from this season to purchase another 100 head of cattle, and assuming market prices remain stable, you would see a significant return within 2 years. Harrison leaned closer to look at her figures, and Margaret was suddenly very aware of his proximity. He smelled of leather and sage, and something indefinably masculine that made her heart beat faster. She forced herself to focus on the numbers, not on the way his shoulder almost touched hers, not on the warmth radiating from his body. How did you learn all this? Harrison asked, his voice carrying genuine admiration. My father was a banker, Margaret explained. Before he died, he taught me everything he knew. He said a woman needed to understand money if she wanted to survive in this world. He was right. Harrison looked at her, really looked at her, and Margaret felt something shift in the air between them. "You are remarkable, Margaret." She felt heat rise to her cheeks and looked down at the ledger. "I'm just doing my job." "No," Harrison said quietly. "You are doing so much more than that." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them seemed quite ready to name. Then Tom knocked on the door, needing Harrison's opinion on a fence repair, and the spell was broken. But after that night, something was different. Margaret found herself watching Harrison when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way he treated his men with firm fairness, the way he always had a kind word for everyone. She noticed how hard he worked, often laboring alongside his ranch hands rather than simply giving orders. She noticed the way he smiled when he saw her, as if her presence made his day brighter. And she noticed the way he looked at her sometimes, when he thought she was occupied with something else. There was warmth in those looks and interest, and something that made her breath catch in her throat. Margaret tried to tell herself it was foolish, that she was reading too much into simple kindness. Harrison had given her a job when she desperately needed one. That did not mean he felt anything more than employer satisfaction with a good employee. She had no business entertaining romantic thoughts about him, but her heart did not seem to care about logic. One Saturday afternoon, about 6 weeks after she had arrived, Margaret was in town purchasing supplies when she ran into Silas Garrett, the foreman from the Double R. He was coming out of the saloon, clearly drunk, and his eyes narrowed when he saw her. "Well, if it is not the little troublemaker," Silas sneered, blocking her path. "Heard you landed on your feet. Heard Harrison Donnelly took you in. Must be nice warming his bed in exchange for a roof over your head." Margaret felt rage flash through her, hot and righteous. "How dare you? I'm his housekeeper, nothing more." "Sure you are." Silas stepped closer, and Margaret could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Women like you are all the same. Use what you have to get what you want." "Step away from her." Harrison's voice cut through the confrontation like a blade. Margaret turned to see him striding toward them, his face set in hard lines, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. Tom and 2 other ranch hands were right behind him. Silas paled slightly but tried to bluster. "Just having a conversation, Donnelly. No harm meant." "The lady asked you to step away. I suggest you do it now." Harrison's voice was deadly calm, which somehow made it more intimidating than if he had been shouting. Silas looked at Harrison, then at the men behind him, and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. He stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. "No problem here. I am leaving." But as he walked away, he could not resist one final shot. "You will see, Donnelly. Women like her always cause trouble. Should have left her in the dust where Rutherford threw her." Harrison took a step forward, his whole body radiating fury, but Margaret put a hand on his arm. "Please, he's not worth it." Harrison looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. She saw him take a deep breath, visibly forcing himself to calm down. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. Just angry." Margaret realized she was still touching him and quickly pulled her hand back. "Thank you for intervening." "No man speaks to you that way," Harrison said fiercely. "Not while I'm alive to prevent it." Tom and the other men had already moved off, giving them privacy. Harrison took Margaret's basket of supplies from her and gestured toward the wagon. "Let me take you home." They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt charged, full of things neither of them was quite ready to say. When they arrived, Harrison helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "Margaret," he said, and then stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "What that man said about you and me, it was a lie. But I want you to know that if circumstances were different, if I thought I had any right to court you properly, I would do so in a heartbeat." Margaret's breath caught. "Harrison, I know it is inappropriate," he continued, the words coming faster now, as if he had been holding them back for weeks. "You work for me, and that creates an imbalance of power. I would never want you to feel obligated or pressured, but I also cannot keep pretending that I see you only as an employee. You are in my thoughts constantly. When I wake up in the morning, I look forward to seeing you. When I am working in the fields, I find myself rushing back to the house just to hear your voice. And when that bastard insulted you today, I wanted to tear him apart for daring to speak your name." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. But they were good tears, joyful tears. "Do you think you are alone in feeling this way? Do you think I have not noticed you, have not found myself watching for you, listening for your step? Harrison, I have tried so hard to maintain proper boundaries, to remember that I am just your housekeeper, but my heart will not listen to reason." Harrison stepped closer, and Margaret could see hope dawning in his eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to court me, I want that too, more than I can express." Margaret smiled through her tears. "I'm saying that somewhere between ledgers and meals and conversations on the porch, I have fallen in love with you, Harrison Donnelly." His face transformed, stern lines melting into pure joy. He reached up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I have loved you since the moment you stood there in the dust, holding your head high even though your world was falling apart. You are the strongest, most courageous woman I have ever met, and I do not deserve you, but I am going to spend every day trying to be worthy of you." "You already are," Margaret whispered. Harrison leaned in and kissed her, soft and gentle and reverent, as if she were something precious and fragile. Margaret melted into him, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, anchoring herself to him. The kiss deepened, becoming less tentative, and Margaret felt heat pool in her stomach, felt her whole body come alive in ways she had never experienced. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "We will do this right," he said firmly. "I will court you properly, the way you deserve. And when enough time has passed that no one can say I took advantage, I am going to ask you to marry me." Margaret laughed, giddy with happiness. "I think I should tell you now that I will say yes, just so you do not spend that time worrying about my answer." "Margaret Dawson, you are going to be the death of me," Harrison said, but he was grinning as he said it, and so began the courtship that had everyone on the ranch grinning like fools. Harrison was scrupulously proper in public, never touching her beyond what was appropriate, always maintaining respectful distance. But in private, stolen moments in the evening or early morning, they would sit together on the porch and talk for hours. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about dreams he had for the ranch, about wanting a family someday. She told him about her parents, about the books she loved to read, about how she had always wanted to see the ocean even though she had lived her whole life landlocked. "Then we will go," Harrison said decisively. "Once we are married, we will take a trip to California. You will see the Pacific." "That's a long journey," Margaret protested, even though her heart soared at the thought. "Then we will make sure Tom can manage things here for a few weeks. You will see the ocean, Margaret. I promise you that." He brought her gifts, small things that showed he was paying attention to who she was. A book of poetry he had ordered from Tucson because she had mentioned loving Wordsworth. A new shawl in deep blue because he had heard her say her old one was threadbare. Wildflowers picked from the range because he knew they made her smile. Margaret tried to protest the gifts, saying he was spending too much on her, but Harrison would just smile and kiss her forehead and tell her that making her happy was worth any price. The men on the ranch watched the courtship with barely concealed delight. Tom in particular seemed pleased, often manufacturing reasons why Harrison needed to go back to the main house during the day, creating opportunities for the couple to see each other. "About time that boy had something besides cattle to think about," Tom told Margaret one day when she was helping him inventory supplies. "Been alone too long, Harrison has. Needs a good woman to share his life with." "I am the lucky one," Margaret replied softly. "He saved me when I had nothing." "You saved each other," Tom corrected. "That is how the best love stories work." 2 months into their courtship, a circuit preacher came through Naco, and the whole town turned out for the Sunday service. Margaret sat with Harrison in the small church, acutely aware of his presence beside her, of his hand so close to hers on the pew that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. After the service, people gathered outside to socialize, and Margaret found herself surrounded by other ranchers' wives, women who were curious about the new woman at the Donnelly Ranch. They were kind, but clearly assessing her, trying to determine if she was suitable for one of their own. "Harrison is a good man," one older woman said firmly. "Deserves someone who will stand beside him and help him build that ranch into something great." I intend to do exactly that, Margaret replied with quiet confidence. The woman smiled. I believe you will, dear. I believe you will. On the ride back to the ranch, Harrison was quiet, his expression thoughtful. When they arrived, he helped Margaret down from the wagon and then took her hand, leading her away from the house toward a small rise that overlooked the property. I want to show you something, he said. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached the top of the rise. From there, Margaret could see the entire ranch spread out below them, could see the cattle grazing, the buildings neat and purposeful, the land stretching away toward the mountains. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. This is my favorite spot, Harrison said quietly. I come here sometimes when I need to think, need to remember why I work so hard. This land, this ranch, it is everything I have built, everything I am. He turned to face her, and Margaret saw such love in his eyes that it nearly took her breath away. Margaret Dawson, I know we have only been courting for 2 months. I know people will say it is too soon, that we should wait longer. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Harrison dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. I love you more than I have words to express. You make me want to be a better man. You make this ranch feel like a home instead of just a place to work. I want to spend every day for the rest of my life making you happy. Will you marry me? He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond, nothing ostentatious, but beautiful in its simplicity. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Harrison, I will marry you. I love you so much. Harrison stood and pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a passion that made her forget everything else. When they finally broke apart, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Oh, how did you know my size?" Margaret asked, laughing through her tears. "I may have asked one of the women in town to help me," Harrison admitted, "swore her to secrecy and asked her to estimate based on your build. You planned this." "I have been carrying that ring for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment." Harrison pulled her close again, resting his chin on the top of her head. "I was terrified you would say no." "Never," Margaret promised. "I am yours, Harrison Donnelly, for as long as you will have me." "Then forever it is." They were married 6 weeks later, in the same small church where Harrison had proposed. Margaret wore a simple white dress that she had sewn herself, with lace borrowed from one of the rancher's wives. Harrison wore his best suit, and Margaret thought she had never seen a more handsome man. Tom stood as Harrison's best man, and the wife of another rancher stood with Margaret. The ceremony was brief but beautiful, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed her with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed at their eyes. The whole community came to the ranch for the celebration afterward. Tables were set up outside, laden with food that people had brought. There was music and dancing, laughter and joy. Margaret danced with Harrison until her feet ached, then danced some more because she could not bear to be apart from him. As the sun began to set and people started heading home, Tom approached the newlyweds with a sly smile. "Your cabin is all ready for you, boss. Figured you two might want some privacy tonight." Harrison had insisted on moving his things to Margaret's smaller cabin rather than bringing her to the main house, saying that the house was for family dinners and business, but the cabin would be their true home, their private sanctuary. The men had spent the past week enlarging the cabin, adding a second room and improving the furnishings. When Harrison carried Margaret over the threshold, she gasped at the transformation. The cabin was twice the size it had been, with a proper bedroom, a sitting area, and even a small study with a desk where she could work on the ranch books. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, and there were wildflowers in a vase on the table. "Do you like it?" Harrison asked, setting her down gently. "It is perfect," Margaret breathed. "Harrison, this is too much." "It is not nearly enough." Harrison cupped her face in his hands. "You deserve everything, Margaret. I will spend my whole life trying to give it to you." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and Margaret felt desire flood through her. She had been taught that the marriage bed was a duty, something to be endured, but the way Harrison touched her, the reverence in his hands, told a different story entirely. That night, Harrison made love to her with a tenderness and patience that brought tears to her eyes. He worshipped her body, took his time learning what made her gasp and sigh, and when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, like two pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. Afterward, Margaret lay in Harrison's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I did not know it could be like that," she whispered. Harrison pressed a kiss to her hair. "Neither did I, love. Neither did I." The next months passed in a blur of happiness. Margaret continued managing the household and the books, but now she did so as Harrison's wife, as a full partner in the ranch. Harrison consulted her on every major decision, valuing her insight and intelligence. The ranch continued to grow and prosper under their joint management. Margaret discovered she had a talent for breeding horses. She started with just 2 mares and a stallion, carefully selecting bloodlines, and within a year had produced foals that caught the attention of buyers from as far away as Santa Fe. It became her project, something that was hers within the larger enterprise of the ranch, and Harrison supported her fully. They worked hard, but they also made time for each other. Sunday afternoons were sacred, time just for them. They would ride out to their special spot on the rise and talk for hours, planning their future, dreaming their dreams. Harrison kept his promise and saved money for their trip to California, determined that Margaret would see the ocean. A year after their wedding, Margaret realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before she told Harrison. When the doctor in town confirmed it, she rode back to the ranch with her heart singing. Harrison was in the barn when she found him, working on repairing a stall door. He looked up when she entered, and his face lit up the way it always did when he saw her. "You're back early," he said, setting down his tools and crossing to her. "Is everything all right?" Margaret took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses that came from hard work, feeling the strength and warmth that had become her anchor. "Harrison, I have something to tell you." He studied her face, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it?" "I'm with child," Margaret said simply. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Harrison just stared at her, as if the words had not quite registered. Then his face split into the biggest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the horses. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing. "We are having a baby," he shouted. "Did you hear that, world? I am going to be a father." Margaret laughed, holding on to him. "Careful, you are going to drop me." Harrison set her down immediately, his hands going to her still flat stomach with a wonder that made her eyes sting with happy tears. A baby. Our baby. "Are you happy?" Margaret asked, even though she could clearly see that he was. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Harrison said fiercely. He dropped to his knees in front of her, pressing his cheek against her belly. "Hello in there, little one. Your father already loves you more than life itself." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Margaret found herself exhausted in the early months and often had to lie down in the afternoons. Harrison was attentive to the point of being overwhelming, constantly asking if she needed anything, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Margaret finally told him, after he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of vegetables in from the garden. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can carry vegetables." "I just want to take care of you," Harrison protested. "You do take care of me," Margaret said more gently, taking his hand. "Every single day. But I also need to be able to live my life. Trust me to know my limits, all right?" Harrison sighed but nodded. "I will try. But if you overdo it and hurt yourself, I am going to say I told you so." Noted. As her belly grew and the reality of the baby became more tangible, Harrison became obsessed with making sure everything was perfect. He built a cradle with his own hands, spending hours in the workshop to get every detail right. He ordered supplies from Tucson, soft blankets and tiny clothes. He even bought a rocking chair and placed it in the bedroom so Margaret could nurse the baby in comfort. Margaret watched him prepare with a heart so full of love she thought it might burst. This man, who had hired her when she had nothing, who had fallen in love with her, who had married her and made her his partner in every way, was now preparing to become a father with the same dedication and passion he brought to everything else. In October of 1884, on a cool autumn evening with the first hint of winter in the air, Margaret went into labor. Harrison immediately rode into town to fetch the doctor and the midwife, then paced the cabin like a caged animal while the women attended to his wife. The labor was long and difficult. Margaret had never experienced such pain, such exhaustion. But every time she thought she could not continue, she would hear Harrison's voice through the door, talking to Tom, his voice tight with worry, and she would find strength she did not know she had. Finally, as dawn broke, Margaret gave one final push and felt the baby slide from her body. The midwife caught the infant, and a moment later, a strong, healthy cry filled the cabin. "It is a boy," the midwife announced. "A big, healthy boy." She cleaned the baby quickly and placed him on Margaret's chest. Margaret looked down at her son, at his red face and tiny fists, and felt love unlike anything she had ever experienced. He was perfect. He was theirs. "Can my husband come in now?" Margaret asked weakly. The midwife smiled. "Of course, dear. Let me just make you presentable." A moment later, Harrison burst through the door as if he had been holding himself back by sheer force of will. His eyes went immediately to Margaret, scanning her face for signs of pain or distress, then dropped to the bundle in her arms. "A son," Margaret said softly. "Harrison, we have a son." Harrison approached slowly, reverently, as if afraid he might break something. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his child. Margaret watched emotions chase across his face: wonder, joy, fear, and overwhelming love. "He is perfect," Harrison whispered. "Margaret, you are amazing. Thank you. Thank you for this gift." "It is our gift," Margaret corrected, "made from love." Harrison reached out with one finger and stroked the baby's cheek. Their son turned his head instinctively, rooting, and Harrison laughed through tears. "He is strong. Look at him." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked. They had discussed names but had not settled on one. Harrison thought for a moment, then said, Henry Michael Donnelly. Henry was my grandfather's name, a good man who worked the land his whole life. Michael was your father's name. What do you think?" "I think it is perfect," Margaret said, fresh tears streaming down her face. "Hello, Henry. Welcome to the world, little one." The first months with baby Henry were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's nose. Margaret marveled at how much she could love such a tiny creature, how her whole world now revolved around his needs and his smiles. Harrison was a devoted father, taking Henry with him on short trips around the ranch, talking to him constantly, even though the baby obviously could not understand. Margaret would watch them together and feel such contentment that she sometimes had to pinch herself to make sure it was real. One evening, when Henry was about 4 months old, Margaret was working on the ranch books while the baby slept in his cradle nearby. Harrison came in from a day of working with the cattle, dusty and tired, but smiling when he saw his family. "How are my two favorite people?" he asked, bending to kiss Margaret and then checking on the sleeping baby. "We are wonderful," Margaret replied. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Harrison pulled up a chair, concern flickering in his eyes. "Is everything all right?" "More than all right." Margaret turned the ledger to show him. "Harrison, we have done incredibly well this year. Better than we projected. The cattle sales exceeded expectations, and my horse breeding program is starting to show real profit. We have enough saved now to expand significantly if we want to, or, Harrison prompted. "Or we could take that trip to California you have been promising me." Margaret smiled. "Henry is still small enough that travel would not be too difficult, and I would love for us to have that adventure together, as a family." Harrison's eyes lit up. "You want to go? Really?" "I want to see the ocean," Margaret said simply, "with you and our son. I want to stand on the beach and watch the waves and know that we made this life together, that we took something broken and built something beautiful." Harrison pulled her into his arms, careful not to jostle the sleeping baby. "Then we will go, as soon as we can make arrangements. Tom can manage things here, and we will take a few weeks, just the three of us. You will see the Pacific, love. I promise." They spent the next month preparing for the journey. Tom was delighted to be left in charge of the ranch, promising to guard it with his life. The other ranchers' wives gave Margaret advice on traveling with a baby, and the whole community seemed excited about the adventure. In March of 1885, the Donnelly family set out for California. The journey was long and sometimes difficult, traveling by stage and train. But Henry was a remarkably good traveler, and Margaret found herself enjoying the adventure more than she had anticipated. She loved seeing new landscapes, new towns, experiencing the world beyond the Arizona territory. Harrison was the perfect traveling companion, patient and helpful with the baby, always making sure Margaret was comfortable, pointing out interesting sights and sharing stories about the places they passed through. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of travel, they arrived in San Diego. Harrison had booked them a room in a hotel near the waterfront, and the first thing they did after settling in was walk down to the beach. Margaret stood at the edge of the sand, holding Henry in her arms, and stared at the Pacific Ocean. It stretched out before her, vast and blue and endless, waves rolling in with a rhythm that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the earth itself. The salt air filled her lungs, and the cry of seagulls overhead seemed like a song of welcome. "It is even more beautiful than I imagined," she whispered. Harrison stood behind her, his arms around both her and Henry, and she felt his warmth at her back, solid and constant. "You were right to want this," he said quietly. "Some things you just have to see for yourself." They spent 3 days in San Diego, walking the beach, exploring the town, letting the ocean work its magic on their souls. Margaret collected shells for Henry, who tried to eat them and made them both laugh. They ate seafood fresh from the bay and watched the sunset paint the water in impossible colors. On their last evening, they sat on the beach while Henry slept in Margaret's arms, and Harrison pulled her close. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "For what?" "For this. For everything. For stopping that day when I had lost everything, for seeing something in me worth saving, for loving me." Harrison turned her face toward him gently. "Margaret Donnelly, you did not need saving. You were already strong, already whole. I just gave you a chance to show the world what I saw from the very first moment. And as for loving you, that was the easiest thing I have ever done. Loving you is as natural as breathing." He kissed her as the sun sank below the horizon, their son sleeping peacefully between them, the sound of the waves a benediction over their love. They returned to Arizona renewed and refreshed, full of stories and memories. The ranch had thrived under Tom's management, and they slipped back into their routines with ease. The years that followed were full of hard work and great joy. Henry grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved the ranch and especially loved the horses his mother bred. When he was 3, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the baby came easier. A daughter they named Mary Rose, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's determination. 2 years after Mary Rose came, another son, Samuel, quiet and thoughtful from the very beginning. And 3 years after that, a surprise, twin boys they named James and Thomas, after no one in particular, but because the names felt right. The cabin had to be expanded again and then again, growing into a proper house that could accommodate their growing family. The ranch grew too, expanding to twice its original size, employing more men, becoming one of the most successful operations in the territory. But through all the changes, all the growth and challenges, Margaret and Harrison remained anchored to each other. They still made time for Sunday afternoons on their special rise, though now they were usually accompanied by children playing around them. They still talked for hours, planning and dreaming, though now the plans included which child would take over the ranch someday and whether they should buy that adjoining property. Margaret never forgot where she had come from, never forgot standing in the dust with nothing but her integrity and a small leather satchel. She made it a point to help other women in difficult situations when she could, offering jobs on the ranch or using her growing influence in the community to create opportunities. Harrison supported her fully in these efforts, recognizing that his wife's compassion and sense of justice were part of what made her who she was. Together they became known as fair employers, tough but kind, the kind of people who would give someone a chance when others had written them off. One afternoon, when Henry was about 15 and already talking about wanting to take on more responsibility on the ranch, Margaret was in town buying supplies when she saw a young woman standing at the edge of the main street, holding a small bag, looking lost and desperate. Something about the woman's posture, the set of her shoulders, reminded Margaret so strongly of herself that day in 1883 that she found herself approaching without conscious thought. "Are you all right, miss?" Margaret asked gently. The young woman looked up, and Margaret saw tears streaking her dusty face. "I worked at the Johnson Ranch. I reported that the foreman was cheating the owner. They fired me for lying. I have nowhere to go." Margaret felt her heart clench with recognition and empathy. "What is your name?" Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Sarah Mitchell, I think I might be able to help you." Margaret smiled at the confusion in the young woman's eyes. "My husband and I run a ranch north of town. We could use someone to help with the household and with keeping the books. Are you good with numbers?" "Yes, madam. My father taught me." "Then we will get along fine." Margaret gestured toward her wagon. "Come on, let me take you home." As they rode toward the ranch, Margaret told Sarah her own story, told her about the day Harrison had hired her when she had nothing, told her about building a life from the ashes of injustice. Sarah listened with growing hope in her eyes. "Why are you helping me?" Sarah finally asked. "You do not know me." "Someone helped me once when I needed it most," Margaret replied simply. "Changed my whole life. I'm just passing on the gift." When they arrived at the ranch, Harrison was working in one of the corrals with Henry. Margaret called him over and explained the situation. Harrison looked at Sarah, seeing the same desperation and dignity his wife must have shown all those years ago, and nodded. "We would be glad to have you, Miss Mitchell," he said warmly. "Margaret will get you settled." As Sarah walked toward the house with Margaret, Harrison watched his wife with the same love and admiration he had felt that first day. She was still speaking up for what was right, still refusing to let injustice stand, still strong and courageous and remarkable. That evening, after the children were in bed and Sarah was settled in the small cabin they now kept for employees, Margaret and Harrison sat on their porch, watching the stars come out. "You did it again," Harrison said, amusement in his voice. "Did what?" "Saw someone who needed help and could not walk away." Harrison took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "It is one of the things I love most about you." "I just remembered what it felt like," Margaret said quietly. "To have lost everything but still have to keep standing. No one should have to face that alone." "No one should," Harrison agreed, "which is why it is a good thing there are people like you in the world." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, comfortable in the silence that had grown between them over the years of marriage, the silence of two people who knew each other so completely that words were often unnecessary. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked after a while. "The day you hired me?" "All the time," Harrison replied honestly. "It was the best decision I ever made. Changed my life in ways I never could have imagined." "Mine too." "Do you have any regrets?" Harrison asked. "About speaking up that day? About everything that happened?" Margaret thought about the question seriously, then shook her head. "No. No regrets. If I'd stayed silent, I would have lost something essential about who I am. And I never would have met you, never would have had our children, never would have built this life. The cost was high, but what I gained was worth everything." Harrison pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I love you, Margaret Donnelly. Have I told you that today?" "Only about 5 times, Margaret said with a laugh, "but I never get tired of hearing it." "Good, because I plan to keep saying it every day for the rest of our lives." The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their children. Henry did take over much of the day-to-day management of the ranch as he grew older, showing the same work ethic and integrity his parents had modeled. Mary Rose surprised everyone by showing a talent for business even sharper than her mother's, and eventually took over the entire financial management of the operation. Samuel became a veterinarian, returning to the ranch to care for the animals after his schooling. And the twins, James and Thomas, expanded the horse breeding program until it became one of the most respected in the Southwest. Margaret and Harrison watched their children grow with pride, knowing that they were leaving behind not just a successful ranch, but a legacy of fairness, hard work, and compassion. The ranch employed dozens of people by the time Henry took over completely, and the Donnelly name was respected throughout the territory and beyond. Through it all, Margaret and Harrison remained each other's anchor and best friend. They still took their Sunday afternoons when they could, now often alone as the children pursued their own lives and families. They would ride out to their special spot on the rise and look out over the land they had built together, remembering and dreaming and simply being together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Margaret by arranging another trip to California. Their children were all old enough to manage without them, and he wanted to recapture some of the magic of that first trip. They stood on the same beach in San Diego, older now but still very much in love, and watched the sunset paint the ocean in brilliant colors. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Harrison asked, his arm around Margaret's waist. "Of course. Henry was just a baby. We sat right about here and watched the sunset." "I told you then that loving you was as natural as breathing," Harrison said. "That is still true, even more true now after all these years. You are still the most remarkable woman I have ever known." Margaret turned in his arms, looking up at the face that had become more dear to her than her own. There was gray in his hair now, and lines around his eyes. But to her, he was still the handsome cowboy who had stopped when everyone else would have walked past. "And you are still the man who saw me when I had nothing and decided I was worth taking a chance on," Margaret replied softly. "The man who stood up for me, who loved me, who gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams. I thank God every day that you were on that road that afternoon." "I am the lucky one," Harrison insisted. "You made me better, made my life matter for more than just building a ranch. You taught me what it means to truly live." He kissed her as the sun sank below the horizon, and Margaret felt the same flutter in her heart that she had felt the very first time he kissed her. Some things, she reflected, never changed. Some loves only grew deeper and richer with time. They returned to Arizona and to their life on the ranch, but that trip reminded them both to treasure the time they had together, not to take a single day for granted. They made a point of continuing their Sunday tradition, of sitting together on the porch in the evenings, of stealing moments throughout the busy days to simply be together. When Harrison was 50 and Margaret was 46, they became grandparents for the first time when Henry and his wife welcomed a daughter. Then came more grandchildren, a beautiful cascade of new life and joy. Margaret loved being a grandmother, loved having little ones around again, loved passing on stories and wisdom to a new generation. But her greatest joy was still Harrison, still the man who had seen her worth when she had lost everything, who had loved her through every triumph and challenge, who had been her partner and her love for more than 2 decades. One evening, when they were both well into their 60s and had been married for more than 40 years, they sat on their porch watching yet another Arizona sunset. Their children were grown and successful, their grandchildren were thriving, and the ranch was more prosperous than ever. They had built something lasting, something good. "Do you know what I think about sometimes?" Margaret asked, her hand in Harrison's as it had been thousands of times before. "What is that, love?" "I think about how close I came to walking away that day, to just heading into town and disappearing. If you had been 5 minutes later, if I had walked a little faster, we never would have met. This life we built, it would not exist." Harrison squeezed her hand. "But I was not late, and you did not walk away. We found each other exactly when we were supposed to. Do you believe that? That it was meant to be?" "I believe that sometimes life gives you a moment, a choice that can change everything," Harrison said thoughtfully. "I could have ridden past you that day, could have decided it was not my problem. But something made me stop, made me offer you that job. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was God, maybe it was just dumb luck. But whatever it was, I am grateful every single day that it happened." "So am I," Margaret whispered. "So am I." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky darkened and the stars began to appear. The same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children, every important moment of their life together. The ranch was quiet around them, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to what 2 people could build when they worked together in love and trust. Margaret thought about the young woman she had been, standing in the dust with nothing but her integrity and a desperate hope that somehow things would work out. She thought about Harrison, riding up on his Palomino horse like something out of a story, offering her a chance when no one else would. She thought about every choice they had made since then, every challenge they had overcome, every joy they had shared. She had spoken up that day at the Double R Ranch, and they had thrown her off the property without a second thought. But Harrison had hired her before she walked away, and that single act of faith and kindness had changed both their lives forever. From that moment of desperation had grown this beautiful life, this love that had sustained them through more than 4 decades, this legacy they were leaving behind. It had not always been easy. There had been hard years when the cattle prices dropped, when drought threatened the ranch, when sickness came calling. There had been worry about the children, fear during difficult births, grief when they lost loved ones. Life had thrown challenges at them, just as it did to everyone. But through it all, they had faced everything together. Harrison had been her rock, her champion, her love, and she had been his partner, his equal, his home. They had built something beautiful from nothing, had created a family and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. As the night deepened and the air grew cool, Harrison stood and helped Margaret to her feet. They walked inside together, their steps a little slower than they had been 40 years ago, but still in sync, still together. That night, as they lay in bed in the house they had built together, Harrison pulled Margaret close. "I love you," he whispered into the darkness, the same words he had spoken thousands of times before. "I love you too," Margaret replied, the truth of it filling her heart even after all these years. Always. And as they drifted off to sleep, wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret Donnelly knew that she was the luckiest woman alive. She had lost everything once, standing in the dust of that Arizona afternoon. But she had gained so much more. She had gained love, family, purpose, and a partner who had seen her, truly seen her, and decided she was worth everything. She had spoken up for what was right, and it had cost her dearly in that moment, but Harrison had hired her before she walked away, and in doing so, had given her the world. Their love story was one for the ages, a tale of faith and courage, and two people who found each other when they needed it most. And as the stars wheeled overhead and the ranch slept peacefully around them, Margaret smiled in the darkness, grateful beyond measure for every moment, every choice, every precious day of the life they had built together. It was a life worth living, a love worth celebrating, and a story that would echo through generations, a reminder that sometimes the worst moments lead to the very best endings. The end.